Chapter 15, Video 2, we're looking at what Southern society was like as we lead toward the Civil War. And on plantations, there were different levels among the slaves on the plantation. If you were a house servant or if you had some skilled work, you were in the higher levels of the slaves on the plantation. If you were a field hand, that was the lowest level of slave on a plantation. There were very few revolts in our history of slavery, which is an unusual thing because they certainly had contact with each other. There was contact from plantation to plantation. They had weapons, but still it was something that was kind of brainwashed away from them from early ages. You can read about it in one of the chapters of A History of Women in America. The only real successful revolt in this time period was led by Nat Turner, and this was in 1831. He killed his master's family and then started moving from house to house, killing slave owners. 55 white people will be killed as a result of this revolt. 17 slaves will be hanged, another 7 will be deported, and some had been killed just in the subduing of this revolt. As much as anything, those slaves would rebel against their masters through sabotage, breaking equipment, working slowly, and so forth. Now, the slave women were valued for their fertility. That was what was looked at. If you were going to sell a slave, you would want to advertise about her proven fertility. If you wanted to buy a slave, you would try to find one who had proven her fertility. And once we could no longer immigrate slaves into the United States, which was beginning in 1808, then on a lot of plantations, having the slaves reproduce became an important task. Now, the women on the plantations were expected to do a man's work if that's what needed to be done. And there was certainly the constant threat of sexual abuse that she could do nothing about. If the owner or the overseer or somebody had taken an interest in her, she could not stop his behavior. Her husband, her father, her brother, nobody could stop the behavior if a white man had taken interest in her. So where slave women will rebel is they will do so again through sabotage, setting fires, poisoning the masters, and so forth, which was fairly easy to do because certainly food poisoning happened far more often back then than it does today. Now, in the slave communities and slave quarters, we need to keep in mind that this was a culture created here from people brought from a number of different places. We talk about slaves coming from Africa, but some had come in the early days and had been taken to the islands in the Caribbean and had lived there for generations before coming up here. Or they might have been taken down to Brazil before being moved up here, generations before being moved up here. You also have slaves coming from Northern Africa, Southern Africa, Eastern Africa, Western Africa, with all kinds of different cultures and belief systems and languages and so on. And then they get put all in one slave area, the slave cabins and so forth, and they end up coming up with their own culture here. Now, the slave family tended to take the same form at that time as white families did, with the father as the head of the household. Now, children started to be given chores at the age of 5 or 6. By the time slave children had reached the age of 10, they were working full-time. And there were a lot of slave families that were broken up where the children were sold off because the owners had more limited means and could not afford to continue to feed some of the children. Now, as far as where they would be sold, the worst possible place for them to be sold was what was called the southern frontier, which is Alabama, Mississippi, in that area, west of Georgia. That area was starting to be settled. It's going to be really hard going there for a while, where mostly men are going to settle because the women don't want any part of it. There was a poorer climate. The land wasn't quite as good. And so it was really rough for white settlers to be successful there, and when they brought slaves there, then the slaves were treated pretty poorly in that area. But the land was cheap, And so that alone will draw people over to that territory. Now, there was early opposition to slavery. Certainly we saw it being argued about in the Constitutional Convention and so forth. But in 1817, there was the American Colonization Society formed. And the idea there was that any free blacks in the United States who wanted to go back to Africa could do so. It would provide money and the means for them to go back to Africa. We see a lot of our early founding fathers supporting this idea, but it turned out that a lot of the free blacks didn't want to go back to Africa. They did not have any familiarity with that part of the world, and this had become their home. Now, in 1821, some agents with this American Colonization Society had gone into Western Africa and bought land and to develop a place where these free blacks could go. And it is today Liberia, with the capital of Monrovia named for James Monroe when he was president, and when this land was being bought. By 1860, though, only about 15,000 free blacks had volunteered to go over to Liberia. As I said, they had already made their home here. Now, among the abolitionists, one of the most famous is William Lloyd Garrison, and he had an abolition paper called The Liberator, where he promoted the idea of abolition right now, not happening over a gradual period of time, but immediate and complete abolition. He will begin a New England Anti-Slavery Society, which will become the American Anti-Slavery Society, and his name will be connected with the abolition movement all the way through until the Civil War. Joining him will be the Grimke sisters. This was Sarah and Angelina Grimke. They had been born and raised on a plantation in South Carolina and had certainly seen slavery firsthand. They were never comfortable with it, however, and when they were old enough, they moved up north. They became Quakers, and then they started to speak out against slavery. And they drew crowds because here was a first-hand account of what slavery was like. They also drew a lot of criticism because women were not supposed to address audiences that had both men and women in the audience. And so the Grimke sisters will also start advocating for women's rights, and that will cause a split in the abolition movement. There were some black abolitionists. Now, there were a lot of white abolitionists who wanted the black abolitionists to take a back seat, but there were some black abolitionists who were involved in the cause. One is Sojourner Truth. She was a former slave who gave a famous speech called Ain't I a Woman, where she was advocating not just for anti-slavery, but for women to have more rights as well. There also was Frederick Douglass. You may have read a narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass in high school. He was an escaped slave who moved north and started to advocate for abolition. His owners started to track him down, and he is going to leave the country and try to earn enough money to be able to buy his freedom, and he, with some donations from friends and supporters, will buy his freedom. And as I said, he'll write something called A Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass. He also starts an abolitionist newspaper called the North Star. And Harriet Tubman is most commonly associated with the Underground Railroad, and for good reason. But she also did some abolition work as well. And if you have chosen the chapter where her work is discussed in A History of Women in America, you'll read more about her heroic efforts.